My name is A.R. Hoffman, and I am the Associate Editor of the New York Sun. What follows are 45 minutes of interviews with the fallen crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried. At one point, his cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, seemed poised to make Bankman-Fried the richest human being on the planet. Then, it all came crashing down when FTX and another firm of his, Alameda Research, imploded. Bankman-Fried was convicted of fraud and other crimes and sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He has appealed that sentence, believes that he was presumed guilty, and maintains that his businesses were always solvent and that FTX's bankruptcy was mishandled. Here from the Manhattan Detention Center is Sam Bankman-Fried in his own voice. These 3 interviews, combined with only light editing, were conducted on the evening of Tuesday, February 18th. Per prison guideline, each interview could only be 15 minutes long and were required to be spaced an hour apart. The conversations cover Bankman-Fried's thoughts on the political scene, his hopes for a pardon from President Trump, his reflections on the judge who sentenced him, and his thoughts on the prosecutor who secured that conviction, Danielle Sassoon, who recently resigned rather than move to dismiss the case against Mayor Adams. Bankman-Fried also shares more personal reflections on what it's like to have all the money in the world and to lose it.
You may begin speaking now.
Hi Sam, it's Ari.
Hey, great to talk.
Let me start. I know you're eager to talk or you have thoughts on sort of the current political environment. Obviously, there's been discussions of a pardon. Your prosecutor, Danielle Sassoon, has been very much in the news. So why don't you, I know we have a limited amount of time, why don't you just start by sharing some of your thoughts about what's happening?
Obviously, lots been going on. And as you said, my prosecutors has been in the news recently for tussles with, Trump's DOJ. My judge as well, Judge Kaplan, who is one of Trump's judges in New York, which is sort of, part of a larger fight going on between the incoming Trump DOJ and, what they see from Biden's DOJ that's been left behind. And, pretty big changes on a lot of fronts, given what the president has seen of the Department of Justice and given what I think a number of people in his camp have seen in terms of, biased judges, in terms of prosecutorial abuse, and in terms of sort of the politicization of the DOJ over the last decades and I would say speeding up recently.
And do you think your trial is part of that story?
I think that's a piece of the picture. Obviously, there's a lot going on. There always is. And, a piece of it is something that happens frequently in high-profile trials where you have, careers on the line for all of the officials involved. And, I don't think that there was a very, fair and balanced view or approach that was taken. A lot of that had to do with judicial rulings coming into my trial. I know President Trump had a lot of frustrations with Judge Kaplan. I certainly did as well. And, one example is he allowed the prosecution to tell the jury that, everyone had lost all of their money. He, in a separate ruling, disallowed the defense from addressing the exact same topic. And, the fact that the story the jury was told was false obviously made that a pretty critical point of the trial. And it's sort of, one point in many.
That's sort of the judicial side. What do you make of some of the tumult at DOJ, especially the Southern District?
Yep.
Do you see, again, anything, do you see your story as linking up to part of a broader story about prosecutorial misconduct?
I mean, I certainly think that there are pieces in common. With my story and with my case more generally, one place you can look is the sentencing of everyone who pled guilty, where you had one Republican who pled guilty to really small sets of the charges, and for its worth, I don't think anyone was guilty. I certainly don't think he was. He got a 7.5-year prison sentence for that. It's 4 times as long as the other 3 combined. All of whom were sort of on the other side of the aisle, and there was a lot of sort of explicitness to the politicization of that, including, threats made to his wife that she would be indicted. She was a Republican congressional candidate if he didn't sort of toe the party line of Biden's DOJ. I think that was one of the more sort of explicit angles of it. But, at the same time, when it came to my piece of it, there were a lot of things going on. One piece of it certainly is that it was starting to come out that I'd been working with Republicans a lot more than had been, previously thought, that I'd been giving to Republicans' conservative causes a lot more than had been public.
Do you think that's a piece of this story too? It's sometimes framed in the press that, you were giving, an extraordinary amount to Democrats, and then the Republicans was sort of maybe perfunctory or just covering a basis. I mean, do you think this sort of public or the administration or whoever kind of got your politics wrong or got your sort of orientation wrong?
I think it's a little bit of each of those.
This call is from a federal prison.
I think it's a little bit of each of those. When I first gave, non-trivial amounts, when I first gave a significant amount in 2020, I gave to Biden, and part of that was not wanting the Democratic Party to become the party of Bernie Sanders. But I would, say that I viewed myself at the time as sort of center-left, and that's not how I view myself anymore, and it's not how I had come to view myself by 2022. I'd spent a bunch of time over the next years in Washington, D.C., working with legislators, regulators, and the executive branch, more generally on a bunch of issues, but a lot of my time was spent on crypto policy, and I, became really frustrated and disappointed with what I saw of Biden's administration of the Democratic Party. I don't know how much I had been, before versus how much the party had shifted. But, on the issues that I knew best, on the ones that I'd spent the most time with, particularly on crypto policy, the Biden administration was just incredibly destructive and difficult to work with. And frankly, the Republican Party was far more reasonable. I spent a lot of my time in D.C. trying as best I could to hope that even though it was at that point sort of a Democratic trifecta, that I could work across the aisle to stop draconian measures from being taken by the administration against the industry.
Let me ask you something. I don't know if you got to see, but it's been much discussed is kind of the vibe shift among leaders of tech and Zuckerberg and Bezos. All these are people I'm sure your path is crossed with. Do you think if the trial hadn't happened to you, do you think you would have been up on that stage at the inauguration? Or let me ask it differently. Do you see what's going on, and do you get it? Or how do you see it? And is your story maybe connected to some of what we're seeing in that culture more broadly?
I obviously can't speak for them, but I would imagine that they saw some of the same things that I saw over the last 4 years. And, I think you saw Zuckerberg express some of that in terms of what I'm guessing he had hoped would be sort of like a reasonable and constructive misinformation stance of the administration that ended up being sort of misinformation, disguised as anti-misinformation, that ended up being something a lot more just like political censorship. And I think that they've had some similar frustrations trying to work with the Biden administration as what I and many in the crypto industry had found on anything related to business and ultimately free speech as well.
What do you think of politicians issuing meme coins? Have you heard about the Trump coin that came out just before his inauguration?
Right.
This call is from a federal prison.
I've heard of it. I don't know that as much as I would like to about it because my information take is
of course
somewhat limited in prison. Unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
But I'm not surprised to see politicians starting to dip their toes into the digital asset space, and I would expect that over time we're going to see more and more avenues of life start to dip their toes in part because it is a much more flexible medium to work in than traditional finance. There's a reason that there's been so much growth in the industry and so much innovation coming out of it, which is, and there are a number of reasons, but one of them is that it's just much easier to build in it. The infrastructure it's newer, it's more open. You don't have to worry about not building in entire regions without crossing patents or regulatorily mandated monopolies or other sort of hallmarks of traditional finance.
Let me ask you. I've spoken to a bunch of people and in the crypto space and in the bankruptcy space, and many of them have expressed severe concerns about how your case was handled, about how the bankruptcy was handled. I mean, many of this is in court filings. But just kind of from your perspective, I mean, there's the political angle here, there's the legal angle here. I mean, what gives you hope? What frustrates you? Obviously something like, we could just say, I mean, the pardon is at the intersection of the political and the legal. I'm just sort of curious about where, as from prison, as you survey the landscape, where are the avenues that seem to you promising?
I mean, I think by far the most frustrating angle, which is recently in some cases become a hopeful one as well, is coming out of the bankruptcy estate. And from the very beginning, it's been absolutely infuriating to see how they've handled the estate. Thinking of the perspective of customers, of the millions of customers of FTX, there were enough assets to get all customers paid in kind, in full, in November 2022. That's how they should have been resolved. That's how it would have been resolved. If, if Sullivan Cromwell, the debtors, hadn't gotten involved. Instead, customers have had to, wait, 2.5 years at this point, while, you start out with a year of pronouncements from the debtor's estate saying that it's hopelessly insolvent, that it's completely bankrupt, a dumpster fire, releasing estimates of $1 billion of total assets and $10 billion of liabilities. And now that $1 billion, I guess, has become $15 billion.
Is it frustrating to you that, you had invested so much in the political sphere and does that feel like not money not well spent, but is there a frustration there that somehow some of these public figures didn't step up?
Part of it was just on both sides of the aisle trying to identify people I thought would be good legislators, and a bunch of the Republican and conservative contributions were private, but have since started to come out. And to the extent that that's the goal, then the metric isn't how they treat me. The metric is what they do for the world. And I'm optimistic that obviously not all of them, but that some of them will end up doing good things for the world and being great, responsible, representatives.
What would you tell, whether it's President Trump, whether it's an appeals court, a regular guy on the street, sort of what has been gotten wrong about your case, about your story, about your work? As a kind of matter of kind of first principle.
Obviously there are a lot of small things and a few very big ones. And so putting aside the small things, misleading statements about apartment complexes and things like that, I think the single biggest thing is that FTX was never insolvent. It was never bankrupt. Neither was Alameda. They always had enough to make good on all of their liabilities. What happened was a liquidity crisis, a run on the bank instead. What that means basically is if you buy a $20,000 car and you buy it on credit from a bank, you're paying it off, you've got $10,000 left to go, and then all of a sudden the bank calls you up and says, hey, you've got 1 week and you got to make good on the entire rest of your payments. The remaining $10,000, where normally would have been years, you're not bankrupt all of a sudden. You're not underwater, but you also don't have the $10,000 in your bank account. What you can do there is sell off the car. You spend that week, you sell off the car, raise the $20,000, and use part of that to pay off the loan from the bank. That's what a liquidity crisis is. When you've got more in assets than in debt, but all of a sudden there's a big demand on cash delivery immediately. banks face the same thing. They take, the scale is obviously much bigger, millions of customers is trillions of dollars. And sometimes all of a sudden, a bunch of customers withdraw over the same period and billions of dollars are demanded. And then it doesn't have all of its value sitting there in cash. It has treasuries, it has mortgages. And so it does the same thing you do, just on a bigger scale, where it sells off its assets to raise cash to, fill the withdrawals. That's what a run on the bank is. They happen. They're, certainly tense days for the bank, but they don't result in people losing money. It's just a question of, how much equity basically does the bank need to give up to incentivize the process to go quickly enough. That's the same thing that happened to FTX. We had, going into the crisis in November 2022, something like $10 billion of positive net value, plus an additional $20 billion of equity value sitting around. And all of a sudden, there's a run on the bank, on FTX. Customers started withdrawing billions of dollars a day from the platform. And so we started doing the same thing that a bank would do, and the same thing you do with your car, which is, selling off, Alameda started selling off all of its investments, its assets to generate cash. And, that's a process which was going to take a few days to a few weeks, but we had offers in already. They'd started delivering to speed it up. And it was, a big production, but the kind of thing that happens, and that doesn't result in customers getting hurt. Except instead of that process playing out, a law firm took over the company and, spent the next 2 years sort of twiddling its thumbs and pretending there was no money left.
Do you believe that you're innocent, Sam?
I do, absolutely. Obviously, there are things that I do differently, and, lots of things I, had a lot of decisions to make as CEO, but by far the single biggest was I backed down from a fight in November 2022, and I should not have let Sullivan and Cromwell take control of FTX. I should have stood up to them, and I didn't. And after that, there were excruciating years waiting. Not just me waiting, but millions of customers waiting, being falsely told that there was no money left and not getting any payments until, recently.
Yeah. And let me ask you, a lot of the sort of prosecutorial story, and this goes back to Danielle Sassoon, SDNY, is of kind of this fraud and this sort of sense of greed and all of that. And I guess for most people, the amount of money you had and handled is almost unfathomable. Let me start. What is your relationship to money? There's been a lot written about kind of your interest in effective altruism, other sorts of things, but, kind of on one leg. What is it like having that much money and what does it feel like? And what was that experience like? And maybe as a way of getting kind of,
a federal prison.
What was your intent here?
It was a phenomenal amount of money that sort of came all of a sudden, over a few year period, more than I certainly ever thought I'd see in my life. And, the way I thought about it basically was I sort of split into two different categories. One was in terms of my own, what I'd say is like sort of personal consumption, my own livelihood. And, from that perspective, my life didn't change that much. I lived on on my salaries. It was a significant salary. It's $200,000 a year, but not billions.
Yeah.
I didn't change my lifestyle that much, and I didn't honestly feel all that tempted to. I never really understood the point of yachts exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It was never something that really appealed to me or felt like a good use of resources. Instead, what I thought about for the sort of much larger scale of money that was coming in was, impact on the world. And, I look at it through an effective altruist lens, basically, which was, well, I've got money to donate. What's the place I think I can do the most good with it? And, some of that went to health causes across the world. People, dying of diseases no one should be dying of anymore, like malaria, schistosomiasis.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it to animal welfare causes, and some of it to pandemic prevention causes, and a variety of others, and obviously some of it in politics as well. And that's where I thought on a much larger scale, because frankly, there are billions of people in the world, and there are millions of people who die of neglected tropical diseases every year, and that's an area where you can actually, it makes sense to think in sort of ludicrously large terms, in terms of sums of money, where billions of dollars can actually be put to effective use in a way that never would have made sense on my life personally.
How have you experienced the kind of twists and turns of the last couple of years?
Yeah, from the personal living perspective, there are a lot of things I don't like about my personal situation right now. Money isn't the important one, and that's not what I miss. Freedom is, but the place where it is frustrating is just that it was. It's a way that I was hopefully be able to have positive impact on the world, and something I can't do anymore. And there were a lot of really great causes and charities that hoped that they were going to be getting significant amounts over the next decade from me, and now aren't. Not only are they not getting that, but they've been tarred by association, with me, and that's really sad to watch, and I feel really bad about it.
Yeah. And you were kind of at the frontier of sort of this Wild West moment in crypto, and whether it was kind of throwing elbows or rubbing shoulders with, some questionable characters or kind of, characters on this frontier of this new industry that was still still finding its footing. Is it frustrating to you that, some of these other people are out and about and without your kind of sense of, altruism, or I don't know. I guess a religious person would say kind of, why me? Is there any of that, or is there any of that sense of, I don't know, like where's the justice here, or anger at that?
I obviously feel really frustrated with what happened with me, but I try not to think about it in terms that are negative towards others. I think it just isn't sort of the constructive or sort of fair and just to them way of thinking about it. At the end of the day, my misfortune, it's not their fault, and they don't, deserve to suffer, just because things haven't gone well with me. And so, the way I try to look at it is, look, a lot of them have done really impressive things with their lives, and obviously we had our agreements, we had our disagreements, but my misfortune doesn't mean that their success isn't earned.
If you find yourself, free again by any means, do you have a sense of what you might like to do, Sam? Do you have do you want to be back in the crypto fray? Has there been any kind of, Saul on the road to Damascus moment? Or is that seem too far off to kind of imagine?
It's far off, and I would think hard about what I wanted to do with my future if and when it came to that point. But I try not to think about it too much right now, because there's nothing I can do. Right now I've got 20-something years left on my sentence, and when you look at, frankly, how the prosecution and judge talked about the sentence, the intention was for it to be one that I couldn't have a productive life after. And so, thinking about what I would do, if that were to change, you'd be sort of putting the cart before the horse.
Is there sort of one thing you miss most? Is it taking a walk and getting coffee? Is it, late night conversations with friends?
It's, the physical aspects have never been they've never been the most important to me. Obviously there's the conversations with friends, but I think even more than that, it's the sort of freedom of information, of being able to access information about the world. Just being able to Google things, is something I really sorely miss. And then on the flip side, being able to try and work on something meaningful. That, those are the two big things that I feel more sorely, missing than anything else.
What is sort of next for you immediately? Do you have any sense of what the next sort of weeks, months look like? Does it feel undifferentiated? Does it feel like there's a kind of narrative arc to it?
The days go by in a pretty undifferentiated manner. There isn't a whole lot to do in prison, and it's, I'm used to sort of trying to dedicate myself to work, and there isn't that much to work on here. But, from a high-level perspective, one thing which is certainly on the horizon is the sort of resolution of my appeal. We have oral arguments coming up, sometime in the next, probably 3 to 6 months for that. And, I feel cautiously optimistic, but the odds are always against anything working in the federal criminal justice system. So, cautiously optimistic just means that I think, that there's a shot, and, I'm hopeful that, I'll get judges who are open to giving sort of a careful and critical look at what happened. Outside of that, it's not a situation where I'm, inmates aren't really in control of their lives. So
Sure.
A lot of things happen, sort of to me rather than by me. And I mean, right now, the thing that that sort of has, all of a sudden popped up is that I might be shipped across the country for the next, days or weeks or months.
And that obviously would be a disruption in your routine, and such as it is. I'm interested in that, that question of being in control. You're someone who, I see as, it's a hackneyed term, but, a disruptor, someone who's, I think fair to say, always felt more comfortable building his own, kingdom than living in someone else's, whether it's, universities or, corporate world or any of that. And here you're, thrown into kind of the most institution of all institutions, and I don't really have anything really insightful to say about it, but just to say that the law is itself just an enormous institution.
Yeah, it's, incredibly frustrating. And, it's really frustrating seeing what a lot of people around me are going through. As well, there's so many different stories here, obviously, everything that you could imagine. But, one commonality is exactly what you said. You're thrown into the system, so to speak, and it's dehumanizing and a place without choice and without sort of agency.
This call is from a federal prison.
For a lot of people, especially people who, don't have enough even to hire a lawyer, and, end up with a public defender, and sometimes they get a great one, but often not. Like, they end up not even in charge of their own cases, their own defense, not even really involved meaningfully, even if they try to be in. And so even their defense is just something that comes and goes without them having a whole lot of input to it. And I don't think it's always in their interest that that is the case. I think sometimes they just get swept the way the system wants to sweep them. Sort of truth be damned. How
have you thought about it? I imagine you're someone who tries to think in and correct me if I'm wrong, in a sort of logical way, or, just kind of a shorthand, a mathematical way, a logical way. You're kind of confronting sort of the legal way of thinking, and has that felt frustrating, to feel like there are these kind of just different paradigms or different worldviews, or kind of Alice through the looking glass, or whatever metaphor you want to use?
Yeah, I'd say there are two parts to that. One part is that the law itself can be bizarre and infuriating and nonsensical. Everything from, like, this obviously has nothing to do with my case, but, I've seen sort of a lot of people's, what a lot of people are going through, and, like, can you kidnap someone for 6 seconds? There's sort of, like, a question. It turns out that in half the country, the answer is, Yes, that's how the law works, and it's a 25-year prison sentence. That's sort of one piece of this, but another piece of it at the same time is that you have these sort of like mini dictatorships, these little fiefdoms in the criminal justice system that are just, they're run by, the judges and or by the prosecutors, depending on which stage you're at. And if the rulings don't make sense, they don't make sense. If there's no recourse, really, to it, there's no competition, there's no, it's a monopolistic system, so to speak. And if the party in power just has no interest in sort of like, justice on an issue, that's just how it is. You can appeal if that takes 3 years. It's 3 years before you even get a second opinion.
Let me ask you, you I think you were sort of starting to, or in the work of imagining how sort of enormous resources could be leveraged for, social impact and effect. Do you think you've worked out a kind of model for how wealth can be effectively used to make the world a better place?
I have some thoughts on it. I certainly don't have the holy grail. I don't think anyone does. But I think there's a lot more that I have to learn than what I know on it, but there are certainly some things that at least started to seem clear to me. And, some of them are just common sense. Some of them are like just paying attention to the details, to the numbers, to the ultimate impact of different causes. I think another piece of it is just that scaling things is really hard. You can often find really effective, sort of interventions at one scale of resources, but you multiply those by 10, and they just end up wasting the other 90% of the money because, either the opportunity is only so big or, the constraint isn't money sometimes. Sometimes the constraint is having a really effective team. And that was just an incredibly consistent pattern we found that, the best movements, causes, charities, institutions are ones that have a really well-oiled team with a clear goal that works well together and has strong but thoughtful leadership. And that's pretty rare. And anytime you don't have that, the efficiency on any possible sort of metric just goes out the window. And frankly, I think you see the same thing in government.
And we're seeing that now in real time. I don't know how much you've seen of Doge and with this. It's a really a live debate about, the reform versus revolution, the scalpel versus the chainsaw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've grown, I think, over time more sympathetic to the chainsaw approach in some cases that, some things actually do need more than a 10% cut. They need a 30, 50, 70%. But of course, they have to be rebuilt in the right way, right? You can't just replace them with a vacuum. We've dealt with departments, and dealing with the SEC was completely impossible for the crypto industry. And it wasn't like it needed to be a little bit more efficient. It was that its entire purpose was to stymie innovation, seemingly.
Yeah.
And somehow it had an absolutely massive employee base to get nothing done.
Sam, you're obviously, your story is exceptional. But as you said, on both appeal and, let's say a pardon, an exception would have to be made for you in some way, even if just with the odds. And I'm just curious, what do you think you're an exception? Is your case kind of sui generis, or is there something here that, could stand for something larger?
I think what I'd say is all the patterns that I see in my case, it's not the only one that has them. There are a lot of other cases that have the same problems. I do think it's a case that when media gets involved, when you have a lot of interest in a case, and when politics get involved, both in terms of partisan political sense, but also in the workplace politics sense, and the career advancement for law enforcement sense, it blows everything out of proportion. And a lot of patterns that exist in a lot of places just sort of reverberate on themselves and grow and sort of metastasize in an unconstrained way. And so, it was, I think, in some ways a particularly out of whack example of some of these, but, mine's not the only.
This call is from
Sam Bankman-Fried.
Hey, Sam.
Sorry I missed 3 p.m. I got caught up with an inmate's legal work.
No worries. It seems to me that your argument that FTX was always solvent, that there were enough assets to pay everybody back, that it was a liquidity crisis ultimately, is sort of central to your argument and appeal, and just how you understand your case and how you understand what went wrong in the handling and prosecution of it. So if you could just lay that out.
I was looking at financials, at balance statements periodically, and then during the crisis, we made sure to figure out exactly what every entity held. I still have many of those financial statements, those balance sheets. We gave all of them to the debtors in case they wanted them. They had no interest in them, though. And I've been following along post-bankruptcy at what happened to them. And every single one of them, from before, during, and after the bankruptcy, showed solvency, showed more assets than liabilities. That was always true. And, and we all knew it was always true. That was sort of the most fundamental metric that we've been looking at. And, if that's not true, then all of a sudden you're looking at potentially being underwater, potentially having a very difficult to solve crisis on your hands. But, in fact, you can sort of graph over time, what happens, and just aggregating together FTX and Alameda for simplicity's sake, looking at assets versus liabilities, and, in sort of the boom of 2021, grew to net asset value of, 40 to 50 billion, plus another 20-30 billion of equity in FTX. There's the crash over the first half of 2022, but even after that, you're looking at something like 20 billion of assets against 10 billion of liabilities. So about 2x leverage, which meant that if there did come a run on the bank, if all of a sudden all of FTX's customers were to withdraw everything that they could from the exchange, we'd have to sell off those 20 billion of assets in order to get cash to pay out effectively. And I should say that 20 billion of assets and then another 20 or so billion of equity in FTX on top of that. It remained true through the crisis, and it remains true today. And so, one way that I look at it as well, what we could have done and would have done and we're working on was back in November 2022, paying back all customers in kind with exactly what they requested in full, even if it got to 100% run on the bank. And we were selling off the investments to do that. And we had liquidity offers, billions of worth, that would let us expedite that process and get it done in a matter of days and weeks. They started delivering already. Looking at today, a lot of customers are frustrated that, it's been 2.5 years, so they didn't get anything back for the first 2 years, and what they're getting back now is sort of the old dollar value of their assets rather than, the crypto themselves. I understand their frustration with that. It was frankly a bit of a weird decision of the estate, of the debtors. When they chose early on, they weren't going to give people back the assets they asked for. They were going to give back just dollars. But it was a decision of theirs. It wasn't a decision they had to have made. And, if they hadn't made it, if they'd done literally nothing, the debtors just sat there twiddling their thumbs for the last 2 years, then today the estate would have, around, depending on, whether you want to include, equity value and what they would have done with the company, 40 to 60 billion dollars of excess value. It would have been...
This call is from a federal prison.
Solvent 3 or 4 times over, and that is with delivering all assets in kind to customers. So not giving them back the $17,000 per Bitcoin from, the petition day prices, giving them back their Bitcoin. And so there'd be no problem making either having, made good on everything in November 2022 or today giving people back their in-kind assets. In fact, with plenty of interest, with all the price appreciation since then, if only there hadn't been a dissipation of assets between now and then.
So what went wrong? I mean, was it that people just didn't know how to read the books? Was it? Do you think it was malice? Was it? I mean, what was sort of lost in translation?
So what could have happened was just spending the next days and weeks in November 2022 liquidating assets. Same thing you always do in a run on the bank. you liquidate investments assets in order to meet the withdrawal demands. And that would have worked. It would have worked shortly. That's what we had been doing. That was one pathway forward. The other pathway forward was what Sullivan and Cromwell proposed, which was they get the company and file some parts of it in bankruptcy protection in Chapter 11, and got sort of hazy from there out about what exactly their plan would be. But we've now seen it. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but we now know what it was, and obviously I can't know for sure what was going through other people's minds, but just inferring it from their actions, you asked, did they just misread the balance sheets? Well, at the beginning they just didn't read them straight up. They refused to seriously consider any documents that the company had created on sort of general grounds of not trusting them.
Mm-hmm.
But they also, while not trusting any of the documentation, immediately came out with confident statements about, the company being hopeless and insolvent, being a dumpster fire, which they can't possibly have had real confident basis for not using the existing material. And it's also not what the existing material showed. My best guess, just looking at their history of statements where they start out saying, $1 billion of assets in late 2022, early 2023. A few months later, they say, we found $5 billion of assets. Then a bit later, $7 billion of assets, and $13 billion by early 2024, and $15 billion in 2025. It just is ever-growing number as they sort of ignore fewer and fewer of the assets that were always there.
Mm-hmm.
Is their balance sheets with the larger number as of petition time.
You try to draw the line for me between the allegation about sort of using customer funds and the way FTX and Alameda were handled, and this argument about it ultimately being profitable.
Right.
How is this all kind of related?
It's a really good question, and a question which, infuriatingly, we weren't allowed to communicate at trial, and which the estates had no interest in either. But, there are two ways you can think about this. The first is, was there borrowing to begin with? Were customers borrowing assets deposited originally by other customers? Or do you have a situation where someone's account balance says they have 3 Bitcoins and 2 Ethereum, and then you have in a wallet exactly 3 Bitcoins and 2 Ethereum matching that? And as to that question, well, that's what FTX US looked like, basically. You had lots of purely spot customers that just had balances of assets in their account, no margin, lending, borrowing, no negative numbers. And the sum of those was what you found in FTX US's wallets. FTX International, though, 80% of the assets there were margined assets, which means these weren't accounts that had, a tenth of a Bitcoin and $13 in it. They were accounts that had, say, $500 of Bitcoin and a negative $400 of Ethereum as the account balance that had leverage on and were themselves borrowing. And so when you have, a user that deposits $100 and
This call is from a federal prison.
and then, buys $500 worth of assets with that on leverage, borrowing the other 400, the exchange isn't going to have $500 of assets representing that account. It's going to have 100. And that was most of the activity, by assets and by volume on FTX International. So, the answer is, of course, there was borrowing. That was sort of the whole point of the platform, was that users could margin their accounts. They could cross-margin them. They could deposit whatever they wanted, send it to FTX as collateral, and then, buy on margin or sell on margin whatever, tokens or futures they wanted.
So your argument is not exactly a moral luck argument where, well, because everybody sort of, there was enough at the end, that means everything else was retroactively right. It's that this was the nature of the platform itself all along the way.
That's right. It was the core nature of the platform the whole time. And, of course, while you're doing that, there is a second consideration, which is sort of an overriding consideration, which is solvency. Because even if people expect there to be borrowing and lending, they also expect that the platform has a reasonable expectation that it will be able to make good on its debt. If you deposit collateral to a platform and you do some trading, you later close down your positions, that the platform should have reasonable expectation of being able to deliver to you what you withdraw. And if it's totally underwater, if it's insolvent, it's not going to be able to. And so that ends up being, the biggest consideration. And if that fails, then sort of everything falls apart. But most of the activity on FTX was assuming that there was rehypothecation, that there was borrowing. That was the nature of the platform. And, for what it's worth, like FTX did always have more assets on hand than the purely spot accounts, the other 20% of assets on the platform that were customers that didn't enable margin, that didn't have futures position. There are a lot of details, obviously. This is just sort of the broad strokes answer.
Yeah.
And you could do a deep dive into the terms of service and the different sections of it and how they apply to different types of assets on the platform, but that's the high level answer.
Yeah. And do you think this question of the solvency, do you think that goes to intent? Or do you see that as linked to the question of intent and, the kind of mens rea requirement for fraud?
I think it does, at least to some extent. And maybe to put this another way, there's a platform, it has borrowing, it has lending on it. And at the end of the day, someone takes and spends so many assets from the platform that it's left completely insolvent. That it's left, owing 10 times as much as it has in assets and value. Not just mismatched assets, but like there's nothing to sell left. Then you're taking actions that are going to lose money.
Right.
For others. Whereas if that's not the case, that doesn't answer all the questions, but it does answer the question of whether fundamentally there was a theft or whether fundamentally there's like a contractual question of what the balance